Hello, everyone. I can see we've had some really outstanding conversations, intense conversations, such an important topic. Thank you for coming this evening, and thank you for not only attending, but engaging and lending your thoughts to this. As was mentioned earlier, I'm Jack Knott. I'm the Dean of NYU Steinhardt. And I'm here joined with two very important people. To my immediate left is Danielle Elleman. She's the Associate Director of the NYU Sexual and Relationship Respect Services. And she would like to get that news out a little more, that her office exists. So if you meet people and tell them about Danielle's office, and then Karen Jackson Weaver, Senior Associate Vice President, Global Engagement and Innovative Advancement. And thanks to both of you for joining us here. We're going to take 15 minutes or so just to have a little conversation. Then we want to, if we have time, open it up, and you'll get a chance to also ask the actors, the amazing actors. Wow, they're so incredible.
Great job.
Yeah, please. Ask them some questions as well, because I'm sure that learning these lines and getting under the skin and into the voice of the people involved shapes them and has an effect on them as well. So we'll get to that. So I wanted to let me start here with you had three questions that you were, or three themes that you were going to look at. And I wanted to just touch briefly on each of those themes. And so I wanted to start out with the one around process and system. And I basically really wanted to ask each of us if you could sort of describe what you think is really wrong or limited in the current system process that we have, and suggestions on how you would improve it. And I'm going to turn to Danielle first.
Wow, that's a big question. I think the process is historically sort of based on, penalizing folks. And I think that there is merit to some of that, but I also think that oftentimes we have to look to, other folks like Indigenous folks who have, created systems that we can draw from as well, to look at how do we reintegrate people into our communities. Because we know that a lot of, punishment doesn't always heal the problem. We look to a lot of our, I work with people who experience harm, sexual and relationship harm, and oftentimes they struggle with whether or not to come forward, right, as we see in the show, and they don't necessarily want these harsh penalties, or maybe they do, but it's a matter of what's going to be healing for them. And I think including them in the process, sometimes they don't always feel included in what's happening in the system. And so, I think there's this, idea that, oh yes, we're taking you into account, but oftentimes our system now is well, we have to represent, what is the broader health of the community. And so I think that there's a lot of challenges in not really sort of listening to what really someone wants to have happen after they've experienced this. So I think that's what's coming up for me, is the historical context of how we've developed our systems of justice or injustice, and how that isn't always the right answer for everybody. And for some people it is, but I think there's a lot of bias in those systems, a lot of discrimination in those systems. I used to work in the system or a hospital where people would report to police, and I would see a lot of discrimination. And so I think there's a lot of harm that comes from that system and reporting to those systems. And so you see in the show, a lot of harm that came out of someone coming forward. So I'll just pause and let you respond as well.
That was a great question. Thank you. And again, I just want to salute the performers for an awesome job. We can clap again for them. They were amazing. And for me, their performances and their words kind of remind us of the potency of the process. And for me, I'm thinking about the point that you raised in terms of the historicity of it. So when you think about the process and when you think about how it exists within different systems, whether it's the political system, which is what we were focused on here, or in many instances, it could be in a workplace or a school. So the process plays out in different ways. The focus here was, of course, on the political process, right? And so I think what's important to keep in mind is how did that process come to be? Who decided how that process would operate? And who ultimately determines what the outcome of the process is? And I loved how the performers were able to kind of interchange kind of the personhood around the different characters, right? And so I remember everything that you all talked about. Like, I was alive during this time. So this was real to me. I remember being a college student and watching this, and we were having debates about this on campus. And so it kind of takes me back to some of the questions that we had about the process and how it came to be and who decided it. And so there were some markers that were really interesting. And I have my phone here because I took some notes. I didn't print them out, but I have them on my phone. But I kind of remember them, so I won't refer to them unless I really need them. But there are a couple of things that came to mind with the process in particular. So the actors in the process, the historicity of it, as I mentioned, but also when you think about the process, who is it meant for, right? So who are the major actors in the process? And it's interesting that when you think about the individuals who were part of the committee, they were all white males, right? Now, the cast here is very diverse, but that kind of diversity, we don't see that in the Senate. We don't see that even today in the House of Representatives. And so I think when we think about processes, whether it's in a political setting, whether it's an educational setting or a workplace, are we analyzing the history of those processes and who they were meant for and the equity that is supposed to be integrated into that process? And are we mindful of who's not been afforded the equity that's supposed to come with that process? Are we coming to that process with that mentality and that understanding? So I'll stop there. There's more I can say, but I'll stop there.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate those thoughts. One of the things that really struck me is that even today, there is no formal basic process for investigating charges of sexual harassment in the Supreme Court hearings. They haven't changed this process despite these pretty traumatic experiences. There's no process or effective guidelines about where a person should go. You saw that in that one case. She didn't know really where to go. Process should go if they have information about a nominee and how to keep that confidential. And, there's, to this day, there's no process for that. There's also no protocol for vetting sexual harassment charges once the confirmation hearing gets underway. And once that gets underway, it becomes public. And then you have this whole tension that you also heard about it being public versus private. To this day, there is no process or protocol for how to vet that in a more confidential, more systematic way. And I would also say that there is no, there's no resources or guidelines on how to protect those who come forward from the kind of risk that they face. And they face tremendous risk. There's those protocols aren't in place either. And there's no idea, and there's no sense that if that you want to come forward on something that you have a civic duty or, as a citizen to do something like that. It's often seen the opposite, right? And so I feel that none of those things I just mentioned have been changed about this process that we just heard about, and they need to be. And I'm extremely disappointed that despite these traumatic cases that have been so disturbing, nothing has happened. I would also mention that going back in the line of this and how these things occur. I've been I was some years ago at Michigan State University, and about the case of Larry Nassar and how the FBI ignored the complaints about his abuse of athletes. And that festered for many, many years. Nobody did anything about it. I don't blame me for this. I then was at USC. And at USC, you may be aware that a gynecologist over many, many years abused students, especially Asian students, and nothing was done about it for 20 years, something like that, even though people were aware of it. Some people reported it to their immediate superior, but it never went beyond that. And they didn't have any system in place for dealing with it. I'm hoping that universities at least have gone and made progress in that regard. But these are recent, especially the one at USC just happened just before I came here in 2018, 2019. So I really feel that despite a lot of public attention to this and so on, we have not seriously addressed the kind of structures and processes that lead to harm and lead to the kind of situations that we experienced here. The second focus was on belief, and I found Anita Hill's book and statements around this really challenging, right? Especially around her saying, is it just enough to say, do you believe me, or is that where the focus should be? So maybe we can have a little thoughts on that, because that's so fundamental to this as well. I don't know, Taryn, you want to start this time?
I guess I'll just say briefly, when you think about belief, and I was thinking about it in the context of what it means in terms of the Constitution and equal protection, and what does it mean in terms of being a citizen. And the connection I was making was really kind of tied to kind of the question and the statement that I made earlier around, when you think about belief, how were we interrogating? And when we were thinking about belief, is the process designed so that if someone came forward with the truth, they were ready to be heard and it would be accepted as truth? So we saw this evening, and I wonder if the American public took a vote, right, and had to decide who was believable, what the outcome would have been, right? Would it have been different? But that's not how it was designed, right? So whether they were believable or not in the public forum, and I think it was at the end, there was a quote that one of you all talked about the process being flawed, right? That it's very flawed. So if the process is flawed, whether you're truthful or honest or not, and you believe the individual, it doesn't really matter. Because at the end of the day, this small group of people hold the power to make a determination who will be who will be sitting on the Supreme Court of the United States making very important decisions that impacts everyone in this room. And so I think about the word, when we were kind of preparing for this and I was reading through everything, the word that came to mind, it's the Latin version of truth, veritas, right? And you could see the veritas coming out in what you all were saying tonight. And it's kind of like, well, are we watching something different? What's happening here? Because for some reason it didn't register. Or if it did, it's kind of, as you suggested earlier, it didn't matter. And so then it means for me, and you may be getting to this question a little bit later, at the end of the day, when we think about the Constitution, I have my copy here, and what it represents. And, I go back to the 19th Amendment and women getting the right to vote in 1920. So I do think we have to look at this and look at the power dynamics, the gender dynamics that are at play in this particular instance, but even how they play out now and what it means. And when we have an intersectional lens and we think about truth, well, gender comes into play, race comes into play, class comes into play. There's so many different elements that come into play in terms of social identity and who's believable. And so I think oftentimes the way the system has been designed, whether you're believable or truthful or not, it doesn't give us the results that we want, because those who are in power, who make the decision, either erase or obscure those social identities or the power dynamics that are at play. And it really undermines the process of what we're supposed to really be seeking, which is life, liberty, and freedom for every citizen. So I'll stop there. There's more I could say, but I'll...
Thank you. Danielle.
Yeah, I think I was really sitting with similar thoughts around, I mean, I think I have some conflicting thoughts around belief, and that is, because of the power structures, right? Like, I liked the play on the gender here, because I think that's really powerful, because oftentimes it's, oh, of course we believe certain people, right? We don't have to tell people I believe you, because of course we believe, and I think like that's sort of an underlying oppressive belief that we have. And a lot of the reasons that I think we want to, sometimes tell people that we believe them is because that for so long we didn't believe that, rape could happen, right? Like there are still states for the longest time that didn't think that you could even like rape your wife or your partner, right? And so it's like we have to counter some of those messages. And so saying I believe you, might, be something that is helpful for some people, like what, Anita Hill had said. But it also means that like I don't inherently believe what you say, right? And so I think that it's important that we listen and support people who experience this. And I think sometimes we want to fix it all for them, and maybe that means saying I believe you, right? But I also know that you can't fix it for people. They have to like go through a healing journey all on their own, and that looks different for different people. And being believed is a little condescending as well. It's like I don't need you to believe me. I know what my truth is. I know that this is my experience of this. But it also is looking for validation from others in order to be able to know that my experience isn't. I'm not alone in it. And so I think that when I respond to someone who's experienced sexual harassment or sexual assault, first and foremost, it's like, what do you need? What are your concerns? How can I be supportive of you? What do you need in this moment? I'm not focused on belief. Sometimes people need the validation because they're not quite sure of definitions. And so they need to know, was this sexual harassment? Was this sexual assault? What is this? And so helping people come to a space where they know those definitions. And I think that that is, quite complicated because of the different systems that we engage with, right? Because I can tell you what I believe these definitions are, but that looks different than even, potentially our NYU policy or the laws, right? Because proving that in various different systems can be complicated. And so it's like, I believe that was sexual harassment. Like that's what that experience says to me. But showing that and proving that in, different systems can be really complicated. So I just think like there's, a way to respond to survivors that you can include, empowerment in that. And I don't know that like, I believe you is an empowerment statement, but I think that there's, people who really need to hear that too.
Yeah, thank you. Those are powerful statements. I was glad that, I don't know who designed these three areas, but that belief was put in here as well, because, in my view, you can have as fair a system or structure as possible, but because of bias and prejudice and so on, you can have a very unjust outcome. And there are layers of that here, especially in the Supreme Court. You have a cultural bias against the credibility of victims and women. That's pervasive in the society. So that doesn't create, that creates an imbalance in credibility right off the bat. You also have power structures that you can see in operation here. You have race and societal backgrounds that play into this, and this is all part of our culture. And until we start changing our attitudes and our culture about this and viewing the role of women in society and so on, and the issue of sexual violence differently, you're going to have this kind of outcome, even if you could produce a kind of fair process. And then on top of that, in this particular case, it's a political process. And if you notice, if you looked at the vote outcome here, it was almost entirely along party lines. And you can see that in our country now, even in spades. You know, I mean, people view the world through totally different lenses based on, you know, their political partisanship. It's become so strong. They see the same event in very different ways. They define it differently. And it's dividing families and friends because of it. So that layer sits on top of all of those other biases and backgrounds. I told Joe this, but this was my first experience with this was so startling. It was many years ago, before most of you were born. It was when O.J. Simpson trial took place. It was televised. It was on TV. I was working at a survey research center, and because it was in Michigan and we did a lot of surveying in Detroit, we had a lot of students who were black students and other people of color and a group of white students, because when you do interviewing, it helps to have somebody sound like the person in telephone interviewing who you're who's the interviewer and the interviewee. And we're all sitting in a room, mesmerized, watching the verdict. And it was startling. O.J. Simpson was acquitted, and all the black students cheered. And all the white students got angry and thought the verdict was wrong. It was to a person. It was such a shock to me. It was the very first time that I had experienced how people perceive things from their background, their upbringing, their race, political view. And it was kind of my first personal experience with this in a very dramatic way, and it was very disturbing. But this kind of thing, you know, that's how people view this hearing as well. You know, you have a whole group of people that think it's outrageous on one side and a whole group on the other. And so this belief is in how people believe and what they see as credible, and how they interpret events is really fundamental, as well as the structure and the process. And that's why changing attitudes, changing culture, changing how we think about these things is just as important as getting the process right. Joe, do we have time? We're kind of run over. Okay. Okay. So maybe it would be best if, you know, if we're going to talk about how, you know, a man playing a woman, a black person playing a white person, and vice. If we could ask, you know, the actors if they could say something. Do we have a couple minutes for that? Anybody would like to speak to that?
Test. Okay, that's better. Yeah. Just while we're getting the other mic, I think I would also just suggest that we also educate ourselves about some of the statistics related to sexual violence as well. I had a link, or I'm looking at a link to the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, and it has a lot of information about how reporting plays out and just some of the ages that people experience sexual assault or rape. And so I would just encourage you to educate yourself and to be in conversation with others about what, in terms of the research, what do the statistics say, right? How do we think about this? And then how does that then tie into bias, and how does that impact our systems? And so much of that, of what you all were able to share with us today, kind of underscores the need for education, for us to really be clear on what the trends are in terms of who reports and who doesn't report. So this is work that I think is important for all of us to do. It's not just women. It's not just people who are survivors. We all have a role in being good citizens of this institution and being citizens of the world, and making sure that we're not just giving kind of rhetoric to what it means for someone to be a citizen and for women to have full rights. So there's much more that I could say there. We're going to have to maybe do this again. Is there
Yeah,
other
thank
questions?
you, but thank you for adding that,
Yeah.
especially as we're a
Yeah.
university and encouraging us to look at the data and statistics and facts. So, okay.
Okay, hi everyone. Hello, it's me again. In the interest of time, I'm just going to share a little bit just to what you just said about encouraging people to do their research. On your seats, when you came in, there's a QR code that has a link to the entire script, the whole piece, the transcripts, and it also has collected resources for furthering, your knowledge on this topic about if something happens to you, where can you go within the university and outside of the university. Right, yes, it's right here. And it also has bibliography of things that helped influence our research on this project. So I encourage you to scan that QR code, check it out, maybe tomorrow, maybe this evening, whenever. And thank you all for being here today. I honestly I'm so grateful. If you have more questions or you want to talk more about the piece itself, please feel free. You can come chat with myself, Joe, Keith, any of our actors after. But again, thank you so much to our respondents for being here. I'll let you wrap it up. But cool. And oh my goodness, yes, thank you for reminding me. Yes, this was taped and live streamed by NYU TV. So again, thank you to our viewers at home who are watching. But if you'd like to watch this again, or if you missed the beginning, or you'd want to just experience it again, you can. This will be posted on YouTube. Yes. Cool.
Thank you all. And thank you, audience, again, for coming.
Yes.